Let's talk about various ways to make boss fights more epic and exciting.
Alrighty,
What
how
do
to
you
make
got?
boss fights interesting. One, gotta have minions because never have one versus the team. It just doesn't work. Two,
Agreed.
you gotta have a unique arena. It can't just be a 25 by 25 square grid. It's gotta have maybe verticality. Maybe it's gotta have some moving parts to it. Maybe it's got
Audience.
a whole bunch of various things. Maybe it's falling from the sky, and you're chasing after everyone else. It has to have a unique encounter to it. And number three, if it is when your party is at full resources, then there has to be draining resources. Or if they have already had their resources drained, then that's a portion of the boss fight that they're not going in at full strength. You got to have either one, two, or three of those to make a boss fight interesting.
The point I will add to help make boss fights more interesting, you ever encounter those situations where you do end up deciding to do a solo monster and the players just instantly take it out? Introduce HP pools. So instead of just having one pool of HP for your boss, say they have 100 hit points, they drop to 0. That's phase 1. The HP refills, we're now into phase 2. The boss changes in some way, they have some new mechanic, they've gone into a rage form of some kind, and maybe do 2 or 3 of these. 3 especially if you don't have any minions, but I do agree with Trevor's point of include some minions.
There are a couple of things that I would do, and that is legendary actions with solo monsters or big bosses or whatever. They don't work. Legendary actions don't work because there's only 3 actions you can take in a round. And if you have a big party, and if you're dealing with a whole lot of people with a lot of different abilities from different supplements, they will just brutalize a solo beast. Everybody else has said things that make perfect sense. But what I do now is at the end of every player's turn, there is a legendary action. You have to do this sort of thing because you've only got between 1 and 3 rounds, and you'll be lucky at higher level if they get to 2 rounds. You might even get a round and a half and she's done. So you've got to make it count. So therefore, I add in more. Now, I know that sounds like totally unfair and unbalanced, but trust me, it works really well because it compensates for the size of your party, okay? Particularly when you're dealing with groups that have 6 or 7 players in them, and they have a huge advantage because of their numbers and action economy. Also too, don't get rid of the idea of, okay, I can only use the legendary actions that I have been given in the monster manual. Take on board any of the stuff that's standard for the creature, it can also do. And take on all of your standard actions that you would use from the player's handbook, like your dodge, disengage, okay? Those things work. Dash, hide, use all of those. I find dodge and disengage, dash, should I say, dodge and dash, very, very useful for getting monsters further away or closer and stopping them from getting pretty much brutalized by a hail of arrows. That's probably one of the best ways to go about that. Now, if you really want to make monster fights really interesting, then put your fight on top of a colossal creature. The fighting on top of the thing. That works really well. I've done it with an elemental. I had a great time. Heck, get them swallowed. Swallow those suckers. Have the fight inside the creature. I've done that too. Giant worms covered in metal plates, Star Wars, I know it's not Dungeons and Dragons. You'll figure it out, okay? But inside the creature, enormous worms work really great. Other enormous creatures, stick them inside. You've already talked about environment, and I would say things like lava work really well, volcanoes work really well, flying ships work really well because they don't stay on the flying ship. They will often hurl themselves off, as I've discovered over the past, and have alternative goals. Goals, don't, if it's just kill and defeat monster, it's not really enough. I'll stop. Did I get them all? Did I steal all your ideas, Volker?
The truth is, I didn't have any ideas to start with. And that's the reason I came up with this question. I wanted to hear your advice, guys. Thank you, losers.
Twist.
Bye.
Oh, that was so smart.
Now I have your wisdom. Yeah. The thing that Danny said about phases, I always judge against making D&D video gamey. But when it comes to bosses, I found that I really enjoy translating stuff like from World of Warcraft. Another thing is that I kind of really like, you know how bosses in a lot of video games, I don't know if you played MMOs, especially in World of Warcraft, they have like a punchline attached to an ability. So whenever they like do a certain like cleave or whatever, or a spell, they will tell something relative to that, or something sketchy. I don't know.
Insect.
Something like that. So for instance, I had this villain of an entire adventure. He looked at a simple detective in Baldur's Gate. He was just a dude. He was so broken by his tragedy that he created a prison realm of his own. My players ended up fighting him inside of this prison realm, and I attached this theme of twisted sense of justice into him, and I designed his abilities to kind of reflect that. I create like layer actions so that I don't have to invest new rules or something, but I actually kind of named them. Like one of them, like, you are your own enemy. And I stole it from Diablo 3, but my players didn't play it, so whatever. When Diablo makes everything dark, and the players have to fight their dark copies.
You know, what you were describing, Fulgid, is actually how they kind of built Dungeons and Dragons 4E monster abilities for solo monsters. Solo monsters were very much like that. Often the descriptor for their power, because they were called powers rather than abilities, was like that. And it's actually a very smart way of doing it. When I had a transition from 4E, and then suddenly you see what is this? God, there's like 1 word, 2 words. That's it. 2 words describes what this thing does, and then you read through the mechanics, and it's like goes on forever. So it's actually been done before, and you could probably steal a lot of that stuff from 4E and transition it into 5E.
Yeah, I've been looking into 4E for quite a while, and I like to run it because I have the core books and I read through them, and I'm like, oh, this looks really interesting. Because I heard a lot of bad stuff about 4E, that it's a lot of numbers, and all these auras and buffs and helpful stuff ends up being just +2, -2. That's what people say, but I didn't play it, so I don't know.
So I played it and I dungeon mastered it, 4E. And I can assure you that at low level, it's actually fine. It's when it gets to higher level, just like every Dungeons and Dragons game,
Pretty
other
much.
than, you know, unless you go back to the originals where you didn't go beyond level 10. Beyond level 10 is actually a stupid idea. I've had many of my friends say this more than a few times, like the game changes so much, and the numbers and the way you have to play is very, very different. With my current group, who are level 15 now, all of my monsters, certainly my big monsters, my big bosses, they all have max hit points. It's not the average. I take the dice, I multiply however many dice by whatever the dice is for that, the hit dice it is, and then I add on that number on the other end. It says plus whatever, 150, whatever the heck it is for the monster, depending on the monster. So they wind up with a monster that you know might have been an average of 150 something, but it's actually now 300 hit points. And you have to do those sorts of things. Otherwise, your battles are like 1 round, 1.5 rounds, 2 rounds, and they have hardly even been scraped. That is just the reality. And frankly, I had the same problem. We had the same problem in 4E. The problem didn't exist quite so much in 3.5, but in 3.5, you can make a character capable of destroying and eliminating boss monsters and never take any damage whatsoever, and they would take it out in the first turn. So can you imagine how bad that is? 5E still suffers from the same problem. Monsters, I use average monster damage, and I roll a 6-sided dice and I add that number to the average for all of the attacks that it makes. This means that on average, it's doing 3 points more than it would normally do, just to compensate for the fact that my players do so much. Those are the sorts of things you kind of have to do with Dungeons and Dragons, and it's actually really important to think about your monster as being not the only monster. Sometimes, it's very easy to be sucked into, but it's not working out the way I wanted to. Well, screw it, mate. There's going to be another monster. Even though it was supposed to be the big bad monster, there are some things that they can do that will circumvent that monster, and banishment is one. That's not the only one that they can cast to sort out their problems. But if it doesn't belong in this realm, they're going to send it home, and it's staying there once they cast banishment. So you have to make sure that you have those legendary resistances so that they can get rid of people trying to lump spells on them that pretty much shut them down or eliminate them completely. And they will always be looking for those 3 resistances. So they'll be trying to figure out how to burn them up by casting spells that will use up those. So as soon as those 3 resistances have been, legendary resistances have been used, and they've got you've got your 3 saves, and they're gone, like that's when they bring out the big one and they finish it off. And that's it. It's happened to me many times. It will continue to happen. It is just the reality of it. And I can assure you it won't change. But there is a way of making them sweat. And you can't take the advice that's on the internet and in the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. And there's really nowhere out there that gives you the kind of information you need to be able to build really tough boss monsters.
As you talk, I get more and more ideas, but we have to wrap it up. This is the last video in this setup, but maybe we'll come back with something more. Thank you guys. Take care.